President Ilves, thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us today. Let's start from a general overview of the NATO Summit. What are your impressions? What did it accomplish? Where do you see any gaps?
Well, first of all, I mean, since it's the 75th, it was, of course, anniversary. Of course, there would be various celebrations, which are kind of difficult to do given the current context of NATO. I went to the 50th. That shows you that I'm an old guy. And then there was reason to celebrate because at that time, celebrating the new members from Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, it was a moment where the world was riding high and Russia was not viewed as a threat. Not perhaps very wisely, but nonetheless, there was a certain optimism at the time. Now the celebration or the celebratory aspects of 75 seem kind of tasteless, I would say, because we are facing a genuine threat, a real crisis, with huge doubts about what will happen to NATO itself, even without the war going on right now in Ukraine. But on top of that, I guess in the back of everyone's mind is, where will NATO be in 6 months? Will it be in 6 months? Combined with various other kinds of disturbing news. I think that the bombing of the Children's Hospital right before the summit began, purposefully or not, we don't know, but nonetheless, it certainly made the hype even more tasteless, I would say, and the lack of action as well. I mean, when you see the U.S. National Security Advisor talking about the strength of NATO, you go, well, where? What is NATO doing? What is it that we should feel so proud about? In fact, I think there is a crisis in NATO, and it's between the values that it purports to defend and the reality on the ground, in which there is I would call it a wimpy fear of escalation, and perhaps even I would go further. It's ever since the invasion on the 24th of February 2022, the West, and NATO in particular, has been engaged in self-deterrence. It took ages for minimal weapons to be sent to Ukraine, to be proud of sending Patriots, which are anti-missile defensive weapons, while continuing a ban on anything but immediate cross-border attacks on Russian positions. All of that, I would say, in sum, leaves kind of a bad impression.
So what do you make of that self-deterrence that you just talked about? Why?
Well, I mean, I could go into a long disquisition, but I would say, first of all, we have still not gotten over the La La Land kumbaya belief in Russia being a post-communist Russia being now altogether different. And if people cling to that, they can't give that idea up. Then, of course, we have some rather mercantile members of the alliance who do not want to do anything that would really upset Russia, lest they not get new contracts once the war is over. So we're, and then third of all, there is clearly a lack of leadership here. No one really wants to do anything, or the smaller, or let's say less capable members are waiting for the big ones to do something, but the big ones don't want to do it or afraid to do it. And certainly a component of self-deterrence, I would say, is very effective use of a concept in Soviet and later Russia thinking of reflexive control, which is this idea of the Russians and the Soviets that you get your adversaries to do what you want them to do by scaring them. And here we are. We see merely by going ballistic, I mean, mentally ballistic, and with Medvedev and various talking heads on TV talking about how they're going to nuke this place or another, the West goes, oh no, we can't do anything because they might nuke us. When in fact, I mean, a rational calculus would show that no, they would not want to take that step because of what it would mean for all of them. So they
I
could
don't think
bluster.
that point is very clearly made, at least in the political circles in the West. Is it? Do you think it's a convenient sort of a scare wall to hide behind, or do you think people actually believe in that Russia might use nuclear weapons? It's hard. It's a big conversation to have, and it's a big risk as well. And we hear this all the time.
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to say since I don't believe that Russia would do something like that. I mean, they have clear rules on when they would, in fact, use nuclear weapons, which really don't differ from the rules of the United States, but it requires a serious attack on a country, and we don't see serious attacks, so we end up with freely firing missiles at Ukrainians who can't do anything about it because they are prevented from using any of the necessary weaponry to take out the airfields and so forth. I mean, on top of that, what is I think often forgotten is also the obligations that the United States and the UK have to Ukraine since 1994 and the Budapest Memorandum. Okay, the wording there did not mean a guarantee. They were assurances. Nonetheless, we must keep in mind that not only did Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons, it gave up its missiles and it gave up its bombers, which today are being fired against Ukraine. There is a moral obligation that the West has toward Ukraine. All of the self-congratulatory back-patting that we saw in the 1990s about reducing the nuclear threat by Ukraine giving up its weapons now has come back to haunt everyone, and people are ducking the issue.
Well, it's a sensitive issue for everybody because it sounds like the West did not deliver on a promise that they made.
It didn't. I mean, that's basically it. It did not. And so that kind of well, so it just becomes very hard to really take the moral claims of the NATO member countries seriously when you make serious promises that you don't live up to. And it's not only the current period.
What do you make of the alliance's statement on China? Since we sort of the topic of this interview is the NATO summit. Was it something expected? Do you think it went as far as it could have gone? What is NATO China relations in your mind? How did the summit address that?
Well, I mean, it was certainly tougher than previous communiques. On the other hand, I mean, that's a whole field and discussion area of discussion, which is what is the role of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with an issue that really has to do with a completely different part of the globe. I mean, where it is relevant is what China is doing as a participant, unacknowledged largely, but nonetheless as a participant in the war against Ukraine. So, I mean, it's stronger than before. I'm not, I don't know what to say, what else to say about it.
Okay. Let's talk about Ukraine then. Do you think,
And there's also Georgia, which
yeah, of
was,
course, yes, we'll get to that. Do you think the language towards Ukraine was strong enough? Did you anticipate something else that did not happen during the summit? So how do you assess that aspect of the declaration?
well, it was clearly signaled already long ago. Any hopes that it would be much different from what we got were unrealistic. So we got a little change in the wording, but it's not really what's needed at this point. I would have been much happier with a firm commitment to, on the part of NATO allies, to eliminate the restrictions on retaliation. That I think would have been an effective decision on the part of NATO, releasing the various obligations that countries have, because as we know that in order to use the weapons that are made in other countries, you need the permission of the producer. And releasing everyone from those kinds of restrictions, I think, would have been far more effective than just relying on the rhetoric that really has no set time or end point.
One of the criticisms or concerns about the summit was that it should not take a NATO summit to give Ukraine 5 Patriot missiles. What do you think from that perspective? Did the
It's hard to
alliance?
disagree, especially that they're coming from various NATO members. I mean, it's not a great accomplishment. And as I mentioned, those are defensive weapons, which doesn't really resolve the problem of glide bombs coming in from planes flown from Russian air bases that no one is allowed to hit.
Now, Georgia. Georgia was mentioned in basically a flying by context where the alliance was calling on Russia to take its troops out of Moldova and Georgia, and that was it. What do you make of it? For all this years since Bucharest in 2008, Alliance was firmly committed to not the map or the immediate membership, but it always stated that Georgia will become a member of NATO. That text and language is gone from this year's declaration. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it was inevitable given the development of the Georgian democracy, and so, I mean, I think it would have been very difficult to actually keep Georgia in there, or sort of just to upgrade the statement as little as it was upgraded, but nonetheless, and include Georgia in there, given the direction that Georgia has gone in the last several years. It was a tough fight anyway to convince NATO members that Georgia was part of the West, and the government of Georgia seems to have done its utmost to convince that it is not part of the West. I mean, it's just it's inevitable that happens if you're trying to join an alliance that is supposed to be an alliance of democratic countries. And in fact, um, the backsliding on the part of some NATO allies, I think, has hardened the position on taking new ones. Because you don't want to repeat of, say, you don't want to repeat of Hungary, for example. I mean, Hungary affects the European Union's view of Georgia today because the behavior isn't very promising.
No. Well, the Georgian, despite since you mentioned the EU, despite the EU's multiple warnings that Georgia cannot become a member of the bloc, with the projection or with the tendencies that the government is showing, the Georgian government claims that yes, we will. It says that by 2030, Georgia will be a member of the EU. So if the EU says no, do you think it's still possible?
I did. I aged 15 years in the 6 years that I ran Estonia's accession to the European Union. And trust me, you don't tell the European Commission we will be members. I mean, it is never a given. It is not a given in the least. It's not going to be. And the negotiations, of course, are really with your own people. I mean, you can negotiate transition periods, but the content remains there, and it would be the government of Georgia would have to basically get rid of a lot of its current laws and change its behavior in order to join. So unless you get a promise to change behavior and to get rid of certain laws, that's not going to happen.
Coming from Estonia and having the experience and breadth of understanding of everything that's happening in the world,
you're giving me an awful lot here.
You deserve it. How do you see the security of the European continent? How do you think it can evolve? And what would be the ultimate outcome of the situation that we are in now?
Well, there's so many factors there that are not predictable at this point. It's just that we will have, I mean, there is a strong likelihood that after January 20th of next year, we will have a whole different approach on the part of the leading member of NATO. That's the United States, while we currently have a strong, at least verbal commitment of the United States to NATO, and as well as the physical and troop commitment, that's not at all clear what will happen should Donald Trump win the election, given the various statements that he has been making over the years. I mean, he wanted the United States to leave NATO already in 1989 or 88. So that's 35 years ago. Where we are now, I mean, his various comments, even as late as this year about saying that if Russia attacked a country that hasn't so-called paid its dues, it doesn't work that way anyway, he would tell them to do whatever the hell you want. That's a quote. So that's well, that's what Donald Rumsfeld called a known unknown, but it's a pretty big unknown. Trying to juggle all of those and trying to come up with a coherent view of what might happen is very difficult to say. We don't know what's going to happen in Russia, where Russia clearly is spending at least 8% of its GDP on the military. That's all up in the air. I mean, what they can do with that? How sustainable that is? And of course, China is another actor in here that it's not clear what they want to do. as I said, the world is so much more complex today than it was in the kind of the extremely simple binary case of the Cold War.